and thanks so much for coming to my talk, and to the hosts of the conference. Thank you very much for having me as well. So I'd like to kick things off with a little example for you, or a kind of case study, I suppose. So this is taken from a paper by Ray Langton, which is about kind of blocking presuppositions. And in this paper, she reports, this is something that she herself witnessed, a light-hearted and high decibel exchange witnessed in 1990 at a Melbourne football game. So, St Kilda supporter to sluggish player, "Get on with it, Laurie, you great girl." Alert bystander, "Hey, what's wrong with a girl?" St Kilda supporter, "It's got no balls, that's what's wrong with it." Okay, so as Langton notes, the St Kilda supporters' response here relies on this sexist presupposition that women are less courageous than men. Balls, of course, being a popular slang term for courage. So what Langton is interested in this exchange is the kind of sexism implicit here and how it's quite difficult to challenge. But there's something else to notice about it too. So with its kind of witty pun on balls and its lightning quick delivery, the remark is also a joke, and a funny one at that. So I contend that one can disagree with the sexist presupposition of the joke, yet still find it funny, and I, for one, am in such a position. Moreover, I take it that this is not an unusual phenomenon. We frequently laugh at jokes we disagree with, and then we kind of feel guilty and complicit for doing so. What are we to make of this kind of divergence between our ethical and aesthetic judgments about jokes? Is there something wrong with finding such a joke funny? Ought we instead to try and kind of bring our judgments together so that we don't find funny jokes that we morally disagree with? And is it even possible to do that? Is there a way to kind of change what we find funny? So these are the kind of questions that I'm looking to answer in this paper. And my plan of action will be as follows. So in section 1, I'm going to discuss some of the existing views in the literature on the ethical criticism of humour, and kind of see whether they can help answer any of those questions that I'm interested in. And I'm going to argue that they cannot. And indeed that where they tend to kind of go wrong is that they over-intellectualize the kind of joke hearing experience. That's why I'm calling this section Funny in the Head. Then in section 2, I'm going to propose a kind of new way of thinking about the problem, where we take seriously the notion of a sense of humour and understand humour as a kind of sensibility, or indeed a taste, hence a funny taste. And I will suggest that our aesthetic judgments about humour are a result of habituation, which is going to point to new ways of thinking about this kind of divergence in our judgments and what to do about it. So that's the kind of plan for the talk, but before I get on to that, it's worth making a few remarks about why we might worry about this kind of divergence between our two judgments there. So I think intuitively it feels uncomfortable when we find jokes funny that we disagree with. I'm going to think about why that might be the case. So I think a large part of it is that visibly, or indeed audibly, enjoying a joke could be taken as an endorsement of the joke and the presupposition that the joke makes. And I think this could come across as kind of threatening or upsetting for anyone who's in the social group that the joke targets. And also it might embolden the teller. So if you're laughing at that St Kilda supporters joke, you know, if they were indeed sexist, then laughing might kind of embolden them in their sexism, or embolden other sympathetic hearers in the beliefs presupposed by the joke. Then a kind of other worry is kind of trivialization worry. Maybe laughing at sexist or racist presuppositions might make it harder for oneself or others to sort of take that sexism or racism seriously. And I think, moreover, laughing at a joke kind of undermines future criticism of it. So it's quite hard to rescind a laugh and whatever your initial reaction to the joke was is likely to be taken as what you really thought, regardless of what you kind of later say about it. So for all these reasons, I think it would be good if we could get our aesthetic judgments in line with our ethical ones. Okay, so let's now see what the prospects are for doing so. So I'm going to start by looking then at what some other people have said about kind of the ethics of humour generally. So the first view I want to look at is what I'm calling the attitudinal endorsement view. And according to this view, there cannot genuinely be this divergence between ethical and aesthetic judgments about a joke. If you judge a joke to be aesthetically good, i.e. you find it funny, this reveals that you ethically endorse it as well. So this is an approach that's taken by both Mary Bergman and Ronald D'Souza, and they essentially hold that if you find a joke funny, find a joke with sexist presuppositions funny, as opposed to merely kind of understanding the joke, then the difference must be that you endorse the presuppositions. So we get Mary Bergman says, being aware of a sexist belief is not the same as holding it. Because a feminist is aware of sexist beliefs, she may see why particular episodes are thought to be funny, yet nevertheless not find them funny herself. And then we get Ronald D'Souza makes the point perhaps even more strongly. He says, merely to know the presuppositions doesn't make the joke funny. What's more, to laugh at a joke marks you as sexist. Okay, so that's the attitudinal endorsement view. Now, based on my little example at the beginning, it won't surprise you to know that I think this view is just very implausible. So you've just seen that it is a phenomenon, and indeed, I think a common one, that our ethical and aesthetic judgments about a joke can come apart. We find it funny, and then we regret finding it funny because we also find it ethically problematic. So I think maybe something that's open to Bergman and D'Souza is to claim that the positive aesthetic judgment of a joke reveals a kind of implicit positive ethical judgment of a joke. So like an implicit sexist bias rather than an explicit one. But then if that's the line they take, then they haven't really gotten us anywhere with our kind of questions about the divergence between the two, because it's not really clear what exactly this implicit bias would be, whether there's anything we can do to change it. So I think that is a line they could take, but then they haven't really gotten us much further with the questions that we were interested in. Okay, and so I find this view implausible, but I do think there are a couple of kind of interesting lessons that we can take from the fact that some people find it plausible. So I think, first of all, this is something I kind of hinted at earlier. I think that where they're going wrong is in over-intellectualizing the problem, by which I mean that they're focusing too exclusively on the kind of the role of belief in joke hearing. So I think, you know, it's true that belief has a role in joke comprehension. We need to be aware of certain things in order to understand a joke. So in the St. Kilda supporter joke that I had earlier, we need to know what it means to have no balls in order to understand the joke. And I think that maybe Bergman and D'Souza have just kind of inferred a bigger role than that and tried to say it also has a role in what we find funny. And I think that's where they go wrong. And we're going to see that this kind of intellectualizing tendency to focus a lot on analytic feminist aesthetics generally. And it's caused feminist philosophers to sometimes miss less intellectual, but still very important features of aesthetic engagement. Okay, and then the other thing that I think we can learn from this view is I think that, to me, it seems plausible Bergman and D'Souza are right that it does seem more likely that a sexist would find a sexist joke funny than that a feminist would, or that a racist would find a racist joke funny than that an anti-racist would. So I think it's certainly possible for the two to come apart, but perhaps there is some kind of weak correlation going on here. And whatever our story about the aesthetic judgment is, it would be good if it could kind of explain that correlation. Okay, so that's everything I want to start this first view then. So the next view I want to have a look at is what I'll call the merited response view. This is a view that's held by Beres Gort, and for him, the notion of the funny or amusing or humorous is a normative one. It is not simply what causes humorous reactions that makes it funny. It is what merits or makes appropriate such reactions. So in other words, Gort thinks that the funniness of a joke or the funniness of a humorous episode is an objective matter, and jokes either objectively merit amusement or not. Moreover, he thinks that a factor that can prevent a joke from meriting an amused response, or at least count against its meriting an amused response, is if the joke relies on immoral presuppositions. So he says, ethically bad attitudes presupposed by the joke tend to diminish or undercut the funniness of a joke. The joke is flawed. Okay, and then we might ask, what does this picture mean for our kind of divergence problem then that we began with? Well, I think for Gort, he's saying if a joke is ethically bad, i.e. it makes immoral presuppositions, then it is to that extent aesthetically worse. But it could still be kind of all things considered good, like more funny than not, or something like that. So in the case where we enjoy an ethically bad joke, if we're to have the right aesthetic judgment, then it has to have a kind of all things considered form. So our judgment should be something like, that joke was funny overall, but it would have been funnier if it didn't rely on immoral presuppositions. And if we think the joke is just kind of unqualifiedly funny, then for Gort, our aesthetic judgment is just wrong. The joke wasn't funny. You thought it was funny, but you were wrong. Okay, so that's the merited response view. Now, Gort has still not given us a story about how we might change our aesthetic judgments if they are mistaken, in his opinion. Given that he thinks that a kind of correct aesthetic judgment of a joke is one that kind of contains a moral judgment of the joke, we might suspect that, like Bergman and D'Souza in the previous view, he thinks that guessing your aesthetic judgment of a joke wrong is just kind of a function of guessing your ethical judgment wrong. And so the solution would be to kind of sort out your ethical judgments first, and once you've got those in order, your correct aesthetic judgment will follow. But I think that this, once again, ignores the whole phenomenon of divergence that we're interested in. And I think basically Gort's kind of objectivist approach can't really help me here, because I'm interested in understanding what we do in fact find funny and how that comes about. Whereas he's interested in capturing what we kind of ought to find funny. So I think that this view isn't incompatible with my own view, but unless we can establish whether and how what we find funny can change, then just kind of knowing what ideally it would be good for us to be amused by is not going to do us much good if there's nothing we can do to kind of get there. Okay, so that's the merited response view. The final view that I want to consider in the kind of existing literature is the effects-mediated responsibility theory. So this is a view that is held by Aaron Smuts, and Smuts is primarily interested in what one's kind of moral responsibility for one's sense of humor is. So Smuts, unlike the theorists I've just previously discussed, is fully convinced by the kind of divergence between ethical and aesthetic judgments. He thinks the jokes you enjoy don't reflect your ethical beliefs in any way. And therefore he kind of thinks, right, well, that means if there's anything that's wrong with enjoying an ethically bad joke, it must be that this enjoyment has some kind of harmful effects. So he kind of moves on to what harmful effects could your sense of humor have. So given that he thinks you don't have to have any particular beliefs in order to find a joke funny, he argues that jokes can't therefore cause belief harms. So he doesn't think that jokes can harm people's beliefs. And then the only other kind of harm that he identifies is when humor snowballs into laughter. So he thinks that laughter can, in some situations, leave the people who feel targeted by it with genuine emotional scars. So he thinks the one way that your sense of humor can be bad is if it makes you laugh at someone and that kind of scars them, I guess. So based on this, he's prepared to make just this extremely qualified ethical claim, which is, insofar as laughter can cause harm, and insofar as laughter is caused by humor, and insofar as our sense of humor can be trained and blocked, we can be culpable for finding something funny. So I, of course, agree with Smuts that your sense of humor doesn't reflect your kind of moral judgments about jokes. I think it's also plausible that a lot of the harm that your sense of humor can cause is a result of laughter. But I think that Smuts still leaves us with some questions. So, for one thing, what does he have in mind when he talks about the training and blocking of our sense of humor? What's that supposed to involve? It's very unclear. Then for another, how much training and blocking do you have to do in order to not be kind of culpable? And then finally, is he right that there's this kind of, the only two conceptual harms that sense of humor could have are belief harms or laughter harms? Or does the fact that he draws this dichotomy betray the fact that even though he's being quite anti-intellectualist compared to the other theorists, he too has kind of focused a bit too much on beliefs and maybe missed other ways that the hearer could be harmed? So I'm hoping that my own discussion in the next section is going to help us answer some of these questions that Smuts' account leaves us with. So we've seen that the kind of current literature on the ethical criticism of humor doesn't give us a story about how our aesthetic judgments of jokes come about, or whether there's anything we can do to bring them in line with our ethical ones. And we've seen that it tends to, the current literature, that is, tends to kind of intellectualize the problem. And it seems to go wrong in ignoring the fact that whether or not we find a joke funny doesn't seem to be related to our beliefs in any kind of straightforward way. So where does the sense of humor come from then? Might think, is it just completely arbitrary what you find funny? Well, I think that's unlikely for two reasons. I think, firstly, it does seem as though there are kind of trends in sense of humor in particular cultures and social groups. And then we also kind of saw earlier that maybe it seems like there's some kind of weak correlation between sense of humor and beliefs as well. Seems slightly more likely that someone will find a joke funny if it accords with their ethical judgments than if it doesn't. So I think these two points together suggest that your sense of humor isn't totally arbitrary. So, okay, what does explain it then? Well, my proposal is that the solution lies, as I've hinted at earlier, in taking seriously our talk of having a sense of humor. And I think that we should treat humor as a matter of taste, or as a kind of sensibility that develops as a result of habituation. So I'm going to argue that what we find funny is a function not of our ethical beliefs, but of the kinds of humor to which we are frequently exposed. And that's going to help explain why different cultures and social groups have their own distinctive senses of humor, and also why maybe sexists are more likely to find sexist jokes funny than non-sexists are, but why non-sexists might well find them funny as well. So, to support my case, I'm going to draw very heavily on the work of Anne Eaton, who develops her own account of taste, and she's particularly interested in erotic taste and its role in She's interested in the feminist critique of pornography. That's why she's kind of interested in erotic taste. So I'm going to draw on her to kind of support my own account of taste. So to start off then, Eaton begins her kind of discussion of erotic taste by talking about feminist analytic philosophy's generally intellectualist tendency. That is to say, a tendency to conceive of sexism primarily in terms of people's misguided beliefs about the two sexes. She thinks, as such, contemporary feminist thought, at least in the analytic tradition, tends to eschew considerations of the role of taste in sustaining the current order. And she thinks anti-porn feminism in particular, which is her kind of area of interest, tends to suffer from this tendency of being overwhelmingly concerned with the falsehoods that pornography propagates. For instance, falsehoods about female inferiority, rape myths, etc., that it purportedly leads its audiences to accept, whether consciously or unconsciously. So you'll hopefully see that what Eaton's saying about belief and taste here is kind of echoing what I've tried to suggest in the case of work on the sense of humour. So what Eaton thinks that anti-porn feminism has neglected then is taste. So what is taste according to Eaton? For Eaton, taste is a standing disposition for evaluative sentiments regarding some X, where these sentiments are partially or fully constituted by or based on pleasurable or displeasurable responses to some of X's properties. So what does she mean by these evaluative sentiments that we're disposed to have? Well, by sentiments, she means to include various occurrent, affect-laden, object-directed mental states, such as emotions, and also some feelings and pleasures. And by evaluative, she doesn't mean to say that they have to involve an explicit appraisal of their objects. So you don't have to have a kind of belief about it. But these sentiments do present their objects as valuable, and so worthy of experiencing, having, or preserving. Okay, and to illustrate this with a little example then, having a taste for designer shoes is going to look like having a tendency to experience pleasure and joy when seeing or wearing designer shoes, and thus perceiving designer shoes as worthy of experiencing, having, or preserving. Okay, so that's the kind of account of taste generally. Then what about erotic taste specifically, which is the kind of taste that Eaton is interested in? So for Eaton, erotic taste is a category of taste which includes a person's sexual taste, for instance, her positive and negative preferences for particular types of sex acts, or orientation towards certain kinds of sex partners. But it also extends to one's general sense of what makes a person sexy or even simply attractive. And Eaton thinks that engagement with pornography in particular plays an important role in shaping our erotic tastes in a kind of patriarchal direction. So she calls this the eroticization of dominance and submission, which I think is an idea from Catherine McKinnon. But importantly, this shaping is not a result of our beliefs about the sexes. It's not primarily that pornography is changing what we believe. Okay, so to kind of summarize Eaton's position then, the key claims are analytic feminism has overplayed the role of beliefs in sustaining sexism, underplayed the role of taste, and an important way in which pornography in particular sustains sexism is that it eroticizes patriarchal norms. So we find them attractive, even though we may believe that these norms are wrong. So I basically want to concur with all of Eaton's claims here about the importance of taste, and I want to apply this account to the realm of humour. And I think that's going to help us to shed some light on kind of what the sense of humour is and how it comes about. So if we apply Eaton's account of taste to the sense of humour, then we get an account of what we might call comic taste. So sense of humour or a comic taste, which will usually be of a person, but it could be of a collective. So we talk about a national sense of humour, for example. is a standing disposition for an evaluative sentiment of amusement regarding some X, whether a particular thing or kind of thing, where this amusement is constituted by or based on pleasurable responses to certain of X's properties. And again, these sentiments don't need to involve explicit appraisals, so finding something funny doesn't have to involve making the explicit judgment, this is funny, but these sentiments do present their object as valuable, and so worthy of experiencing, having, or preserving. And to illustrate this with a little example again then, having a taste for puns, a comic taste for puns, I should say, means having a disposition to feel pleasurable amusement towards puns, to see puns as valuable and worth experiencing as a result of their tendency to give one pleasurable amusement. So that's the account that I'm proposing of comic taste. How plausible is this? Well, I think it fits well with our kind of ordinary talk about sense of humour. So first of all, people do in fact seem to enjoy different kinds of humour. Some people say I've got a dark sense of humour. Some people say I've got a very childish sense of humour. And they do seem to find that kind of humour to be worth experiencing and seeking out. And I also think that my account fits well with the common conception that different cultures have distinctive senses of humour. And there's this kind of culture shock that people get when they go abroad and they think they're unable to see what's so funny about the new country's comedy. And worse yet, no one in that country finds them funny at all. So I think my account can kind of capture these two bits of data quite well. Okay, and then we might ask, so supposedly sense of humour is this kind of standing disposition for certain sentiments. So how do we come by these standing dispositions? So I'm going to draw on Eaton again here. So Eaton, when she's talking about how we come by erotic tastes, endorses an Aristotelian model of habituation. So according to this model, which I'm afraid this is a rather long quote, the disposition to feel properly about some object in the world is inculcated in a subject by repeatedly getting the subject to have that feeling with the right intensity towards the object. Representations can play a critical guiding role in habituation by encouraging their audiences to imaginatively engage with represented objects, say characters or inanimate objects or events, situations, and so on. And representations solicit from their audience particular sorts of sentimental responses and train them on represented objects in our imaginations. And in repeatedly doing this over time, inculcates in this audience a predisposition to respond similarly to similar objects in the real world. Okay, so that's a very lengthy quote there. Kind of break it down. So in the realm of erotic taste then, what does this mean? How does this model work? So I think the upshot for erotic taste is basically what we find attractive is shaped by what is time and again represented to us as attractive. A key part of this habituation will be engagement with representations like kind of visual media generally, so things like advertising or art, so on. And Eaton wants to claim pornography specifically is going to have a very big role in this habituation. She thinks that constantly watching certain bodies or certain acts portrayed in an eroticized light, and by an eroticized light she means presented with particular vivacity and detail aimed at erotically stimulating its target audience. We keep being exposed to this, this will gradually lead us to find those things erotic, regardless of what we may believe about equality of the sexes. And as a result of this picture, Eaton recommends that the key to combating sexism that's sustained through erotic taste is by encouraging the creation of and engagement with feminist pornography. So that'll be pornography that, for example, eroticizes female pleasure and empowerment, features more varied body types, and therefore it's going to start habituating people's erotic tastes in a more egalitarian direction. So I find this kind of Aristotelian habituation via representation model pretty plausible as applied to erotic taste. And I want to argue that comic taste is developed in the same way. So if we apply this account to humour then, we get the idea that what people find funny is going to be shaped by the comedy to which they are exposed. So if we keep engaging with representations that portray a certain thing in a humorous light, by a humorous light, I have in mind maybe you kind of deliver a line with a pace and tone that implies this is a punchline, or maybe there's something happens and that's accompanied by canned laughter, or perhaps it's portrayed in a way that foregrounds kind of similarities with other things that are widely considered to be funny. If we keep engaging with representations like these, then we will come to find those things funny. So for example, if we keep engaging with sexist humour, we'll develop a taste for sexist humour, regardless of our beliefs about the sexes. And then if this account is right, then analogously to Eaton's position, the way that we can train our sense of humour for the better is going to be to expose ourselves to more explicitly feminist or indeed anti-racist or anti-homophobic humour. We may not find it funny at first, but once we get used to it, we will develop a taste for it. So that's the accounts I'm proposing of how we come by our sense of humour, and I suppose what we can do about it. So how plausible is this picture? Well, I think first of all, it fits well with the whole judgment divergence problem that we began with, because it makes it possible that what you find funny comes apart from your beliefs. And I also think it fits well with the idea that different cultures have different senses of humour. So within a particular culture, there'll be certain representations, comedic representations, and people come to find those things funny. But between cultures, representations will differ, and therefore so will senses of humour. I think if we're to find this model really plausible, we're going to want it to be supported by the psychology of humour, and especially kind of developmental psychology of humour. So is this actually how infants come to find certain things funny? So I think what we'd expect is, if this habituation model is right, then it would be the case that very young children's senses of humour will develop in response to representations or kind of cues from adults or older children or comedic media, that this event or this object or this image is something that is appropriately laughed at. And I think this is supported by psychological research. So I'm going to draw on some research by this developmental and cultural psychologist, Vasudevi Reddy. He's done lots of studies into development of humour in infants. And she notes that in infancy too, and perhaps especially so in infancy, other people's responses to events can change the emotional atmosphere, enabling the carving out of objects of fear, distaste, and funniness. Something really remarkable, I think, is that even something as apparently physical as tickling seems to require social cueing to be found funny. So she says, she finds in one study, even at older ages, tickling, despite its apparent physicality, seems to require a build-up, a social wrapping to make it funny. For infants in particular, it seems to be the social interaction of the tickle, not the tickle itself, which is funny. So I think that's really interesting, because we think of tickling as the kind of, there's like not much room for, I don't know, taste there. And then this importance of kind of cueing or like representation is even more apparent in what she calls the phenomenon of infant clowning, where the infant seizes on others' laughter to sometimes accidental actions by the infant and repeats them to re-elicit laughter. There are examples from her studies which suggest that actions by infants appear to have become humorous objects solely by virtue of the parents' amusement at them. Just as adult clowns pick up on things that amuse others and play on these things, so infants are both sensitive to, interested in, and motivated enough by others' laughter to pick up on the causes of others' amusement and repeat them. And then just a final quote here. So this was across 4 different studies, I think. She finds numerous examples from infants from the age of about 7 months. That's when the earliest study began, of infants seizing on adult laughter to a variety of actions and repeating them. So lots of quotes for you there. But I think that in all of these studies that Reddy's done, her findings do appear to support something like this kind of habituation via representation model. So it seems to be the presenting of something as an object of humour that leads children to come to view it as funny, or as Eaton might put it, to view it as worthy of amusement. Okay, so that's kind of the bulk of what I want to argue today. So I've argued, just to kind of summarize then, that sense of humour should be viewed as a matter of taste rather than a function of one's moral beliefs. And I've defended this kind of habituation via representation model of the sense of humour, based on and analogous with Anne Eaton's account of Erotic Taste. So I think there's more to be said to kind of flesh out this account, but that's what I have space for now. I just want to make 2 kind of concluding remarks, which I think are 2 thoughts about kind of upshots of the picture that I'm proposing. So the first thing I want to think about is, what does this account mean for responsibility, which is something I'd kind of mentioned earlier in the talk. So taste kind of seems, well, maybe it did before this talk, seems like a very personal thing that people are often reluctant or feel kind of unable to critique. And I think, oh, my tastes are an important part of just who I am as a person. But we've seen that taste is actually more malleable than it may have seemed, and indeed more kind of important in sustaining ideologies than we might have realized. So in my opinion, it seems not unjust to claim that everyone has some kind of responsibility to critique their tastes in jokes. And if they find that their aesthetic judgments don't match their ethical ones, then they have some kind of responsibility to expose themselves to material that might train their sense of humour for the better. So that's a kind of weaker claim, but more strongly I want to say, certainly there's going to be a responsibility on people who control what comedy is available to us, so the people at Netflix or Amazon Prime or whatever, to commission more diverse programs to avoid habituating people's tastes in a problematic direction. Okay, and then the very last thing I want to say is to come back to that very long quote I had from Eaton about the habituation model, and just look at the very last sentence of that, where she says, representations solicit from their audience particular sorts of sentimental responses, train them on represented objects in our imaginations, and in repeatedly doing so over time, inculcate in this audience a predisposition to respond similarly to similar objects in the real world. So in the case of pornography, Eaton thinks that imaginatively engaging with fictions can shape our sentiments about similar objects in the real world. So we kind of transfer those feelings to the real life versions of what's being represented. So is that plausible in the case of humour? Well, to me, I think this points to a worry that I kind of mentioned at the beginning, that maybe humour can have some kind of trivializing effects. And I think I find it especially a plausible idea in the case of kind of visual humour, more so than linguistic humour. So the idea I want to float, basically, I don't know what you think of it, is that imaginatively engaging with fictions that portray, say, misogynistic or racist acts in a humorous light could actually make it harder for a viewer to perceive the kind of real life versions of those acts as the serious acts that they are. And if this is right, then contrary to what Aaron Smuts thought, then there's a way that the joke can harm the hearer, which is neither a belief harm nor a laughter harm. If the habituation account is right, then I want to suggest that maybe humour is capable of a kind of perception harm. And this would certainly be no laughing matter. Thank you very much.